Deputy Thomas Broughan, Tánaiste to reply, please.
Thank you, Deputy Broughan. I have made some comments in relation to this in reply to an earlier question. The programme for a partnership government prioritises a significant programme of investment in Garda Síochána. Obviously, I won't repeat all that I've said already, but just to highlight again the recruitment and the investment and the resources and the ICT investment that is now made possible. At the end of last year, there was money made available, for example, to improve the pulse so that it is more effective in terms of the management of criminal investigations, and a number of other initiatives were also taken in that area. The 2016 budget for Garda Síochána saw an increase. It's 1.6 billion now for the Gardaí. That was 67 million in additional funding, and obviously we also moved decisively, as I said earlier, with increased funding to deal directly with gang-related crime, particularly in the Dublin area, and the dedicated armed support unit as well. That is very concentrated policing measures in the area, and there's a huge effort being made by the Gardaí to target and to do the kind of work necessary to interrupt the cycle of violence that we have seen. I have mentioned, obviously, the investment, the capital plan. There's also the airborne surveillance with the money that has now been available to make sure that we have the kind of technical support for the helicopter that's being used so that it can be used at night as well. And all of these initiatives, plus the determination of the men and women of Garda Síochána who are out on the streets patrolling, will, I hope, ensure that this cycle, which is a dreadful cycle — we did have the numbers of murders and gangland crime, the numbers of murders had decreased very considerably last year, but we now have had this new cycle with 6 murders with the gangs who are intent on revenge. But every resource and every resource that's needed by Garda Síochána will be made available to deal effectively with this gangland crime.
Thank you. Deputy Broughan.
Thanks, Ken Corley. Well, Minister, I think you yourself and the Garda Commissioner met community leaders from the inner city there recently, and there's a peace procession, I think, tonight, an area of our capital city which is absolutely traumatised by this series of assassinations over the last number of months, and by a perceived failure of your department to give Garda Síochána the requisite resources to stamp it out and to bring it to a close. Now, I note you've mentioned, and you referred in the earlier question to the additional Gardaí and to the additional capital resources, but is it the case, for example, that units such as the National Surveillance Unit had adequate resources during your administration and Deputy Shatter's administration to keep tabs on the kind of gangland crime and organisation which, obviously led to the current desperate spate of murders? So, do units like that, you mentioned the armed support unit, but have these kind of specialist units, have they got the resources necessary? Do you also, in relation to legislation, I mean, do we need more legislation and further legislation? I remember the 2009 Criminal Justice Act, Minister. It tried to target directors of crime, gangland, mafiosa leaders.
Thank you, Deputy Broughan.
Do you need to bring in more legislation, and particularly in relation to guns, to the proliferation of guns and gun-related crime?
Thank you. Tánaiste.
Well, I reject your analysis, actually, in relation to the resources, because, if anything, the last government has been keenly aware of the need to invest resources as they became available in Garda Síochána. But as I've said already, clearly during the period of economic difficulty, effectively investment was stopped for a period on Garda Síochána, and that has had its effect. But in relation to gangland crime, I mean, the figures that are available suggest that the Gardaí were being effective. But of course, what you're seeing now is actions. It's a feud, obviously, and feuds between criminal gangs and, as I said earlier, intent on retaliation. And the very best policing in the world can make it very difficult to interrupt such a cycle. But we saw in Garda Síochána interrupting it, for example, in Limerick, where 24 out of 25 murders were solved with huge effort by Garda Síochána, by the local community, and support from government. And I want to assure you that the same motivation is there, both from myself as Minister, from the government, and indeed from the local community, as I saw yesterday, to do everything possible to support people who live in those communities, but also to interrupt and bring to justice. These people are not outside the law, and I believe that the law is strong enough. And also we have the Criminal Assets Bureau, which will continue to work to target the proceeds of crime.
Thank you very much. Deputy Broughan.
And thanks again, Can. And our rural colleagues obviously have been speaking of the closures, extensive closures of stations. Do some of the Dublin stations need to reopen, Minister? The former Lord Mayor, Councillor Christy Burke, made a point about Fitzgibbon Street Station, for example, whether or not a 24/7 presence there was necessary. And can I just ask you, in relation to the direction of gangland crime from outside this jurisdiction, I mean, what steps have you taken in liaison with, say, the Spanish Minister of Justice, for example, the Policia Nacional, actions under the European arrest warrant legislation? What kind of actions are you taking to strike at the alleged external directors of savagery on our streets?
Thank you, Deputy Broughan. Tánaiste, to conclude.
Well, obviously this type of crime certainly has an international dimension. There's no question of that. There's very detailed exchange of information with police colleagues in the various countries, Spain, the Netherlands, Belgium. In fact, there's been quite a number of high-profile criminal trials in those countries and prison sentences